Hello, Professor Ant. I would like to present my master thesis. The topic of my master thesis is the representation of risks in Jonathan Rabin's Surveillance and Caroline C's There Will Never Be Another You. I would like to start with the introductory part with a brief summary of it. The importance of my master thesis, as I argue, uh, is that in the course of the previous decades, risk theory has developed into an interdisciplinary matrix. Still, however, the topic of risk is for the most part unknown for literary and cultural scholars. So the purpose of my master thesis is to contribute to the merger of risk analysis and literary studies by analyzing different types of risks into contemporary novels. The aim of this thesis is to analyze the representation of medical risk and risk of terrorism in Jonathan Rabin's Surveillance and Caroline Z's There Will Never Be Another You. This is my thesis statement. The paper explores the character's risk assessment, risk perception and risk management, as well as examines different questions related to risk that both authors raise. Now I would like to read the table of contents. So there are 5 parts. The introduction I've just summarized. The analytical part is called Definitions, Contexts, and Review of Literature. It was a theoretical part. As the analytical part, I analyzed the representation of risks in Rabin's Surveillance and in There Will Never Be Another You. So I would also like to say that I still haven't finished the conclusions about the conclusions of the There Will Never Be Another You. So I'm not ready to present the conclusions yet of the second novel. However, I would like to read the introductory part that I made towards these 2 novels and the conclusions that I made of the first novel that I made. And I would also like to introduce the focal points of There Will Never Be Another You that I analyzed analyzed in my master thesis. So, as for the table of contents, about the representation of risk in Rabin's Surveillance, I analyze cases of the risk of terrorism, the character's reaction on the risk of terrorism, anti-terrorist measures, the character's reactions toward anti-terrorist measures, the role of the media in the novel, cases of medical risk and the risk of terrorism, and other types of medical risk. As for the representation of risks in C's There Will Never Be Another You, I analyze cases of the risk of terrorism, the character's attitudes and reaction towards the risk of terrorism, the role of space in the novel, cases of medical risk, and the relevance of old age, the reaction of the main characters in medical risk and medical ethics. Now I would like to describe the main parts of the theoretical part of my master thesis. They are in the section review of literature, I review only Sylvia Meyer's article Dwelling in Crisis because it is the only secondary source that I found on the topic of risk in a literary text, because, as I said, the field is still unexplored. As for the section definitions, I write about etymology of the word risk. Then I mention several categories of the of, of risks, such as environmental risks, lifestyle risks, medical risks, interpersonal risks, economic risks, and criminal risks. And I provide my definition of medical risks and risk of terrorism. Medical risk I define as a potential danger created when performing a diagnostic or therapeutic procedure or is a result of a behavior which may lead to a disease and consequently involves the necessity of a medical treatment. Risk of terrorism I define as a potential dangerous situation involving exposure to an act of violence or the threat of violence with the goal of inciting terror to achieve a stated or implicit political, religious, or ideological goal. Then I briefly describe different sociological risk approaches. Uh, these are the major. The first approach is the risk society approach, developed by Ulrich Beck and Anthony Giddens. I also write about Mary's Douglas risk as culture, the cultural perspective of risk that she developed, and Foucault's governmentality approach. Then I write about risks in the age of postmodernity. I argue that due to the disappearance of grand narratives, people live today in the world that has to make decisions concerning in future under the condition of manufactured and self-inflicted insecurity. In other words, people live today in world risk society. It is Ulrich Beck's concept. I also provide Beck's definition of risk, which is not a real but an imagined hazard, or as he calls it, it is an anticipation of the catastrophe. Then I argue that it is exactly imaginative and anticipatory qualities of risk that turn it into an important category of analysis of work of fiction. Afterwards, I introduce such concepts as risk narratives, as well as narratives of anticipation and narratives of catastrophe. These are two groups of risk narratives introduced by Sylvia Meyer. After that, I describe 9/11 narratives or which is also called ground zero fiction. And I also write about political and cultural relevance of 9/11 attacks and the role of media in the creation of different perceptions of 9/11 attacks. Afterwards, I write about medical narratives and illness narratives. As for the analytical part, I would like to introduce the introductory part of the introduction towards the two novels. Surveillance by Jonathan Raban and There Will Never Be Another You by Caroline Z are two post-9/11 novels that show the complexity of life in world risk society by depicting juxtaposition and interconnection of multitude of risks. For this reason, the novels can be characterized as risk narratives, specifically narratives of anticipation, since in neither of the novels a large-scale anticipated catastrophe takes place. Rather, they depict the intensification of the sense of threat as well as characters' response to it. Surveillance and There Will Never Be Another You show how risk perception, risk awareness, and risk management are instrumental in characters' decision-making process, and as a result play a big part in their lives. Both novels demonstrate how various risks not only determine the characters' experiences, but also have a profound impact in reshaping of their identities. Although the central topic at stake is the impact of risks of international terrorism in characters' lives in post-9/11 society, it can be claimed that another prominent type of risk which is shown in the novel is medical risk. So the conclusions that I come to concerning the first novel, Surveillance, are that there are 4 different perspectives on risk of terrorism, and these perspectives are immensely influenced by characters' personalities, the character's current state of life, and characters' life experiences. Their perspective on risk of terrorism have their strong and weak points. However, this shows the diversity of perspectives shows the complexity of the issue and the fact that it is nearly impossible to come to the solution when it concerns such an international phenomenon as risk of terrorism. Also, I argue that mass media in the novel creates and intensifies the feeling of fear by exaggeration of a partial falsification of the events. The dialogic quality of the novel reveals the variety of characters' attitudes, both to the risk of terrorism and the governmental anti-terrorist measures. It can be summarized that the characters' perception and assessment of the risk of terrorism and reactions towards it are also strongly influenced by their personalities. As for the characters' attitudes toward the anti-terrorist measures, they are more dependent on the characters' political standpoints. As for medical risks, I came to the conclusion that medical risks are interconnected with other types of risks. They can be triggered by risk of terrorism, for example, and the omnipresent anticipation of catastrophe has a negative effect on the citizens' mental health. As for anti-governmental measures, they prove to be unsafe since accidents may happen during the performance of certain exercises, and also due to the environmental damage that these measures create. As for other cases of medical risks, they are divided into 2 groups. Those which are in their early stages, such as risk of alcoholism, obesity and lung cancer, and so-called unmanageable risks, or risks inevitably leading to catastrophe or death. As for the first group of risks, these risks can be easily prevented. The characters, however, prefer not to deal with these risks, since it can be suggested that they do not regard these risks as risky enough. The last group of risks is analyzed from the perspective of the character's reaction towards them. It can also be stated that the character's reaction on their approaching death is strongly connected by the perception of risk, which is in its turn influenced by the personality and life experience. As for the novel There Will Never Be Another You, it is set in Los Angeles in the near future, and it focuses on the life of 3 generations of a middle-class American family. I argue that the novel uses alternating characters' focalization, thereby revealing a diversity of risk perception and assessments. The novel depicts the escalation of the risk of terrorism, showing how the risk turns from a local phenomenon into a global one, which allows to characterize the novel as the narrative of the world risk society. There are several questions that Caroline C. raises in the novel, which are related to the risk of terrorism. These are the question of communication between the government and the common people. The second one is related to the fact that is concealment by media extremely dangerous events from the public, And the last one is the question of ethnic stereotyping. I come to the conclusion that there are three three main reactions towards the risk of terrorism that major characters have. These are escapism. One of the characters he runs away from risk of terrorism. The second one is intentional involvement in um, dealing with the risk of terrorism. So and the last one is ignoring of risk of terrorism based on disinterest in this phenomenon at all. I also analyzed the role of the UCLA Medical Center in the novel, and I argue that it is not only a place designed for resolving cases of medical risk, which is its primarily function, it is also a place which is connected to the risk of terrorism, and it can be considered as a platform um, where both type of risks come mm, are created and dealt with. Um, so this is my analysis of my master thesis. I'm still working on the conclusion. As I said, I'm still working on the conclusions on the of the second novel. So this is why I introduced it very briefly.